Hi YouTube, welcome back to another little art doll video. So this is another doll from my Japanese mythology collection. This is the Phoenix that I did, which is currently available in my shop at creaturesthenet.com. I also have payment plans available, so just shoot me a message if you're interested in finding out more about that. So I'm starting off by, I have cast some parts in resin, so I'm just cast the head for this one. And I'm just doing a little bit of modding work with some epoxy sculpt. So I wanted the eyes to be really thin, and I wanted to leave them white to give them a sort of mysterious look to them. So I'm just adding some epoxy sculpt around the eyes and just creating a shape that I'm happy with. And then I'm going to be adding a few more details to this face. So this resin cast was originally like a westernized phoenix that I've made multiple times using this cast, and I also incorporate glass eyes into this one, but for this I'm just leaving them white, so I didn't do any glass eyes with this one. And then I'm going to be creating this little feather bit on the middle of the head here, just above the beak. And again, I've just rolled it out in some epoxy sculpt and sort of feathered out the edges so they're nice and thin, and rolled it up into like a little swirl, I guess. And then I'm going to be painting this a nice green color. So I'm just adding it to the resin using just some water to smooth it out. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to add these things to resin. Sometimes it's a little bit slippery, but you just got to keep working at it, and it'll eventually stick and dry rock solid. And then I'm going to be adding these little ears to the sides of the head. Again, just drawn out some patterns on the inside of the ear and smoothed it out using some just plain water. I always wear gloves when I'm using epoxy sculpt too, just to protect your hands from any chemicals or anything like that. And then I'm just modding the beak a little bit to make it a little bit bigger and give it more of a refined edge to it, and just smoothing it out so you can't tell that I've added anything to it. And then I'm going to be painting the whole beak in a nice yellow color. So I'm using some chrome acryl, water-based acrylic paint to paint these parts, and I'm going to be matching it to some sequin fabric that I have, which I'm going to use for the bulk of the body. And then I'm going to be using some green faux fur for like the chest area. So this one I'm using Deruvian Matisse, some red, and just painting it up really roughly to begin with, obviously being careful around the areas that are going to be a lighter colour. Red's really hard to cover, so just being a little bit more careful with that. And then I'm going to be painting some highlighted areas using some green. It's like a nice forest green by the brand Chrome Acryl as well. You can use any acrylic paints that you have. You don't need to use the same brands that I use, but I particularly like these two brands of paint because I like the consistency of the paints. So once that's all painted up, I'm going to start working on the feet. So I'm using cosplay for the feet, and I'm going to be having a wire armature inside of it, so it's slightly bendable so that it stands a little bit better, or helps it pose a little bit better, because it is only on two legs. So it's always difficult to pose a doll that is on two legs. So I still have the Kickstarter cosplay. I haven't gotten around to buying the new stuff because we don't have any stock here in Australia. So it's really difficult to find stock here of what I want. I think you can get this beige colour, so I might have a look again, but I've been trying to get some grey and it's just out of stock everywhere. So we'll just have to be patient and wait for a restock, I guess. So the cosplay one Kickstarter version is really difficult to work with, so I don't use it quite often, but I'm trying to get rid of it, and so I can use like new batch stuff because apparently it's much easier to use. So I'm just covering the armature in a thin layer of the clay, and then adding the little toes and everything to this one, and adding some little scales using some rolled out bits of cosplay and just adding them on top, and they'll sit nicely on there and create like little scaling patterns on the toes and everything. So I am then going to add little scale patterns using a sort of a stamp. It's just the end of a tip that I have, and it's like a nice round good sized tip, and I just basically stamp all of the patterns onto the rest of the legs. So sometimes it helps to put a piece of plastic, a really thin piece of plastic over the top, and it stops it from sort of digging into the clay. But I found the cloth clay is, well, this one in particular, has like a little bit of elasticity to it, so you can sort of press it and it won't dig in as much as doing it to polymer clays. So I just went ahead and did the rest of it without the plastic. Alright, so the armature for this piece is, the main body is a ball and socket armature that includes the legs, and I've also used a wire armature for the wings, and that sort of works as like a thin bone because I think the ball and socket armature is a little bit too thick for this for wings, so I sort of do a combo set and just combine it with some epoxy sculpt so it doesn't come off. Then I add a little bit of pipe cleaner around the armature so I can start needle felting the body. Obviously the body is really thin for this one, so I don't need too much polyfill, but I do just end up needle felting the body so it has like a nice muscle tone, and then I can put the scale fabric and the faux fur over the top. So I'm starting off with the faux fur fabric first, and I'm just doing a little underbelly piece here. So what I'm doing is just wrapping it on the inside, and I'll pin it to the body and then cut out a rough shape of what I want it to look like. I don't want to cover it too much with this faux fur because I wanted the body mostly that sequin fabric. So I've just pinned it together and started cutting all the areas out, and then I'm going to move on to the sequin fabric. Okay, so this is the sequin fabric that I'm going to be using. It's nice red color, and it is like that sequin flip fabric where you can flip it the other way around and it's a different color. So the other side is silver, and you flip it back to the red. So I was originally going to do green and a red body, like a red faux fur, but I couldn't find any sequin fabric that I liked that was the right colored green, so I ended up doing it the opposite color, which works out really well anyway. So I'm just cutting out a really rough section of the sequin fabric that I'm going to be pinning to the other side of the body, and then I'm going to trim it off when I start sewing it up and pinning it all together. And it's always difficult to cut sequin fabric. I have a video on how to cut sequin fabric, specifically for Artdolls if you're not too worried about making too much of a mess. So you just need to take your time when cutting this sequin fabric so the little bits don't go flying everywhere. So I'm basically pinning these two fabrics together, and then I'm going to be sewing it up using a lattice stitch and also pulling it tight so it contours to that needle felting that we did before. Okay, so it's always good to get a good quality thread when you're doing a letter stitch, especially if you're using faux fur, because you've got to pull it quite tight to create a really tight seam, and so it doesn't go loose or anything. So the cheaper the thread that you have, the easier it will snap with the tension that you're pulling. So I use Gutermann thread, and I can pull the tension pretty good. Or you can find some upholstery thread. It's quite thick, and you can pull it really tight. So I've used that a lot on my Flying Fox dolls. So moving on to the wings, and I'm doing all the feathers out of felt this time. So this felt is a little bit more stiff than the regular felt. So I just basically drew out the first feather and then continued using it as a template, and just roughly drew the rest of the feathers out on the felt so I could cut them out. And I'm cutting them out using a large pair of fabric scissors. I found this had a better control and would stop the edges from looking square, if that makes sense. Okay, so for the wings of this one, I decided to do a combination of sewing each feather on and gluing it, so it has like another bit of reinforcement. And I'm just going over a couple of times around the metal or the armature and securing that feather in place by going around a few times, and then I'm going to glue the end together so it definitely won't come off, and making sure it is nice and tight every time I do it. And as you can see, it's very time consuming, but I wanted the feathers to be pretty sturdy and, you know, not have a chance of coming off. So I'm just using my regular thread here that I normally use, nothing too special. And because it's going to be glued, you don't have to use your expensive thread either. So if you have cheaper thread, you can use that as well, because you're going to end up gluing the thread together anyway. So you don't need that tension too much. And here's a little look at the wings once I've done that first layer of feathers. So I'm going to do a second layer of feathers in a green felt to match the rest of the green that's on the body. And I'm going to be using the same sort of felt as the first feathers. And I'm just going to be cutting out a, I don't even know what shape you call it, this shape that you can see on the screen. And I'm going to be placing them over the top of the red ones and up against the edge, and then I'm going to finally cover it with the sequin fabric. And I'm just using some of that tacky fabric glue that I use for everything, and just doing a thin line down the middle so it's not too smothered with it, and just sort of placing it on top in between where the feathers meet in the red. So for the sequin fabric, I'm just going to be cutting out a piece of fabric that will cover both sides of the fur, so it will make it like a nice seamless transition to green feathers and red feathers, and it sort of transitions it to the body as well. So I'm just applying some of that same glue that I used, and just making sure that I don't overload it because I don't want it to come through any of the fabrics, and I just want it to look nice and neat. So I'm using 2 pieces of fabric here, and it sort of blends in really nicely once you've laid it on top of each other. For the tails, I am using a different type of felt, so this one is more flowy and it's not so stiff, and it works really well for tail feathers because you want them to be flowy. And I've just drawn out some patterns that I want to use. I'm only doing 3 of these long tails, and using my big scissors to cut them out, and it's just a nice flowy looking wave with a rounder end at the bottom because I'm going to be putting some patterns on the entire feathers. So just cutting them out, and then what I'm going to do with this one to make them a little bit more realistic is I'm going to just cut out some of the edges to sort of feather it out, make it look like a feather rather than it just being like a stiff side like this. So I'm just cutting really small slits into the side, and it sort of ends up looking very feathery. So it's a good little trick if you're using felt to create a feather look. And for the patterns, I've probably spent more time than I needed making these little patterns, but I wanted it to be like a one piece of felt rather than just layers. So I ended up cutting out 3 of these types of shapes and gluing them together, and then finally gluing them onto the end of the tails just so they look like little eyes. So I just ended up gluing the edges together, making sure I don't use too much glue so it doesn't leak out the side. Doesn't matter if it's on the back because you're going to be gluing the back down anyway. So it's probably spent way too much time on these tails, but I kind of like the way they turned out anyway, so I guess it was worth it in the end. And just going over with a black strip down the middle just to create that feather bone, and a couple of little patterns using some dots of felt that I sort of rolled up into a ball and just placed haphazardly over the entire feather just to create like just some patterning on the fur. So that's a little look at what the longer feathers look like. Like I said, I did 3 of these, and then I ended up gluing them onto the exposed ball and socket armature that I had left for the tail. And I'm just using a bulldog clip to hold them together, and then I leave that overnight to dry. And then I'm going to be adding more feathers once these adhere to the armature, and then it sort of looks a bit more full once I add the rest of the feathers. So I ended up doing some orange feathers, smaller ones, and then also finally some smaller, really thin green feathers just to tie it in a little bit better. Once that was all glued together, I then went and sewed up all the loose ends in this to make sure there's no armature exposed or anything like that. I left a little bit of longer sequin fabric at the end of the tail so I could sort of cover all of the edges that I glued together, so it's nice and seamless. And that's pretty much it. I also added just a bone on these longer feathers as well, not the thinner ones because they're too thin. And yeah, that's pretty much the whole process of making this Venus. Like I said, it's in my shop, creaturesandat.com. If you're interested, payment plans are welcome. Just shoot me a message. Thanks to my patrons for supporting me. I really appreciate it. You can check me out, patreon.com. All the links are in the description box, including links to my Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and my shop. So don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Help my channel grow. And I will catch you in the next one. Bye.